All right. Brother Mellick called me earlier. Not feeling well still. Went to urgent care. Asked me to cover for him. So we'll be picking up in Genesis chapter 5 to kind of pick up, as usual. I don't want to pick up where he left off. I'm going to leave that for him as a message that he was given. And I will pick up where I left off the last time I covered for him. Genesis chapter 5. If you would stand, we'll read the scripture facing the Temple Mount. This is the line when Elohim created man. He made him in the likeness of Elohim, male and female he created them. And when they were created, he blessed them and called them man. When Adam had lived 130 years, he begot a son in his likeness after his image, and he named him Seth. After the birth of Seth, Adam lived 800 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days that Adam lived came to 930 years, then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he begot Enosh. After the birth of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Seth came to 912 years, then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he begot Kenan. After the birth of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Enosh came to 905 years, then he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he begot Mahalalel. After the birth of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Kenan came to 910 years, then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he begot Jared. After the birth of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he begot Enoch. After the birth of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Jared came to 962 years, then he died. After Enoch had lived 65 years, he begot Methuselah. After the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with Elohim 300 years, and he begot sons and daughters. All the days of Enoch came to 365 years. Enoch walked with Elohim, then he was no more, for Elohim took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he begot Lamech. After the birth of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Methuselah came to 969 years, then he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he begot a son, and he named him Noah, saying, "This one will provide us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands, out of the very soil which Yehovah placed under a curse." After the birth of Noah, Lamech lived 595 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Lamech were 777 years, then he died. When Noah had lived 500 years, Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This is the word of Yehovah. Please receive it. All right. It's the record of Adam's line. Let's dig into this. And some people would ask why, and I used to ask why. I was like, why on earth do I need to know the descent from Adam to Noah? Or Noah. Why does that matter to me? Almost 6,000 years later, on this side of Mashiach, Why would I care? And I thought that because I had not studied it. And when I studied it, I was so moved. Spent several weeks studying it. I was so moved. I was preaching in Lafayette, Indiana at the time. And I began to teach on it, a series, and I had a gentleman come up to me afterward, and he said, "Why do we care? This doesn't mean anything to us." And I sat that man down and gave him a lecture that could have been a sermon of its own. I am fully convinced that there is nothing in Scripture that is there by accident. There's nothing there that does not matter to us today. This is the record of Adam's line. When Elohim created man, he made him in the likeness of Elohim, male and female, he created them. You know, we talked, when we did Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, we talked about how there are a lot of churches, a lot of mainline groups out there who have gone to saying that there were multiple creations. He created people first. It didn't work out, so he created them again and gave them the same names. But you know, those same churches, I've never heard one of them point to this chapter and say, see, this is a third creation. Now, if that logic follows, if Genesis 2 is a second creation of mankind, why would Genesis 5 not be a third creation? Either we believe that, or we don't. Does this make sense to everyone? We cannot follow the logic of that doctrine and not see, and then read chapter 5 of the same book and not see a third creation. And yet, there is no mention in Scripture of multiple creations. So this is a remembrance. This is a recognition of the history. And when they were created, he blessed them and called them man. When Adam had lived 130 years, he begot a son in his likeness, after his image, and he named him Seth. After the birth of Seth, Adam lived 800 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days that Adam lived came to 930 years, then he died. Okay, it's very important for people who have been hit with the doctrine that either Cain married a monkey and created black people, or that we could not all come from the same two people, Adam and Ava, because it only says that they had 3 sons. Who did he marry? Oh, well, let's go to that multiple creation concept. He created Adam and Eden. He created a race over here. He created a race over here. Nowhere in Scripture does it say that. But it gets preached all the time. It says here that he lived 800 more years and he had sons and daughters. Where did Cain find his wife? She was his sister. Now today, that seems very taboo to us. And later, when Torah was put down, it was told to us that we would not have that kind of relationship with our close relative. But this early on, this close to the issuing of the curse, human beings were still pretty much genetically pure. And it would have been perfectly safe to have children whose parents were that closely related. Now, it seems odd to us, but if you look at Abraham and his Ima, Sarai, they were half brother and sister, and no one blinked an eye about that. In fact, when he went into the foreign lands and they would say, "Who is this? Is this your wife?" He'd say, "This is my sister." And he wasn't lying. She was his sister before she was his wife. Later, we received a commandment not to do that. I believe because the curse had taken a fuller effect by that point, had done more damage to the human chromosome, and we could no longer marry that closely without our children having horrible, horrible side effects. When Seth had lived 105 years, he begot Enosh. After the birth of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Seth came to 912 years, then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he begot Kenan. After the birth of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Enosh came to 905 years, then he died. We see a lot of something happening here. We see people are born, they have children, and they die. Do we understand this was not the perfect will of Abba? Abba Elohim wanted us to be born, have children, and love them for eternity. He did not will for death to enter the world. His perfect will was that we would obey him and avoid death. But our ancestors chose death. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he begot Mahalalel. After the birth of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Kenan came to 910 years, then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he begot Jared. After the birth of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Mahalalel came to 895 years, then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he begot Enoch. After the birth of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Jared came to 962 years, then he died. I'm reminded of a sermon I once heard from Brother Jones. Brother Jones in Newburgh, not Brother Jones that I listened to in Tennessee. Brother Jones from Newburgh talked about tombstones. And he says it's hard to find a tombstone where it doesn't say, "Here lies so-and-so." And there's a beginning date and an ending date. And some people do the math and say, "Look how many years they lived," or "Look how many years they didn't live." He says, wouldn't it be so much more fruitful to look at that dash and think about how they lived? Because that's really all our lives are, is a running dash. We're born and we have a number of days that we're going to live, and we don't know how many they are. And what we do from that first number to that second number, whether people say, "Look how old he was," or "Look how young she was." What we leave behind are not those dates. The world thinks about those dates. What matters in his kingdom is what we do with the dash. Shaul said, "I have run the race. I have run a good race. Fought the good fight." He was talking about what he did in the dash. He was talking about what he did besides have children, which as far as we know he had none. The only child he mentions being his, or the children he mentions being his, are Timothy and Titus, and he says that they're his sons in the faith. And we know for a fact that Timothy was not his son because Timothy's father was Greek. So what we know that he was talking about in his dash was the kingdom. And the most notable thing that we've read so far in the first however many generations this is, well, we're talking about Enoch, and he's the seventh from Adam. So in the first 7 generations, all we've talked about so far is that they were born and they had children and they died. I love all of my children, but I want to do something great for the kingdom. That even if no man remembers what I did, I want Elohim to remember that I did something besides be born and have children and die. And I want my children to be part of my legacy so that my work carries on, maybe not in the same form, but my work of evangelism and my work of teaching carries on to future generations. But I want to do something more than be born and have children and die. I challenge each of you to think about what you want to do with your dash. That short line in between the date of your birth and the date of your death, because it's really not that many days. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he begot Methuselah. Now we're getting interesting. Methuselah, oldest living person recorded in history. He lived a lot of years. We're going to get to that here in a second. After the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with Elohim. Holy cow, somebody who did something besides have children and die. Enoch walked with Elohim 300 years, and he begot sons and daughters. All the days of Enoch came to 365 years. Enoch walked with Elohim, then he was no more, for Elohim took him. Now let's take a look at this. How is this different than every other record we read so far? Does it say he was born? He lived this many years, he had children, he lived this many more years and he died? Is it a he had children in the middle of his life sandwich story? No. He walked with Elohim 300 years. It's sad. I know people who call themselves believers who probably haven't walked with him for 300 days. He walked with him. He had sons and daughters. He continued to walk with him. And then he was taken. And some translations say that he was translated directly to heaven and into the heavenlies. Okay, the Hebrew word here alludes to that, but literally it just says that he was taken. As in, Elohim reached out and said, "Come with me, my good and faithful servant." Took him by the hand, stepped him through the curtain, and no one saw him again. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he begot Lamech. After the birth of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Methuselah came to 969 years, and then he died. You see that? We're right back to the status quo. One man interrupted it with the great thing that he did, walking with Elohim. I'm not saying that none of these other men knew Elohim in a saving fashion. I'm saying that they did nothing so outstanding that it is recorded in Scripture what they did. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he begot a son, and he named him Noah, saying, "This one will provide us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands, out of the very soil which Jehovah placed under a curse." After the birth of Noah, Lamech lived 595 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days of Lamech came to 777 years, then he died. If you do the math, and this is what really opened up my eyes to the importance of the genealogy, if you do the math here, there is a glimpse of the influence in the life of Noah. He had a father, Lamech, who did nothing spectacular that we know of. He had Methuselah, the oldest man who had ever lived, outlived his sons. But other than that, did nothing spectacular. And he had Enoch. Enoch was his great-grandfather, who walked so closely with our Creator that he was invited into the heavenlies whole. And according to our doctrine, our understanding of the later scriptures, he will be one of the two prophets in the last days, come back into the world to share the truth with a dying race called humanity. And that Enoch was still alive when Noah was born, and influenced him as he had not been able to, apparently, to influence his son or his grandson. He influenced his great-grandson, as my grandfather influenced me. On his deathbed, my grandfather wept with tears of great sorrow over the souls of his children, because he questioned whether they had ever chosen to follow the Creator. But he was able to impart to me the heritage to which we cling. And there's a lesson in that, and there's a lesson in this passage that we never give up. That we never stop speaking the truth. That we never assume that because certain people have not heard the truth, that we should just give up. That we should just cease to proclaim the truth of His Word. Because the time comes that we do, and when we do, when we cease to do that work, whole generations are lost. I'm reminded of the congregation in New Ross, Indiana, where I spoke, and people came up and said, "How dare you talk about my life in your sermon?" And I had no idea who these people were. I was a visiting minister at that time. They had not called me as their intern. No clue who these people were, but Elohim was speaking through me to them. And I had one woman came up to me, an elderly lady. I loved Frances Ruth. Before I left that town, I loved her like a mom. Old enough to be my grandmother, but I loved her like a mother. But she walked up to me that first time she heard me preach. She had to have her sister-in-law, they were both widows, she had to have her sister-in-law help her walk up there. And she said, "I want to shake your hand, young man." She said, "You don't know this, but my husband was an elder in this congregation for nearly 50 years. And I have not heard the word preached like that since he died." And I did not know it then, but I learned later that in the absence of sound preaching, an entire generation of that community had basically been lost. I had the joy of leading 31 individuals to salvation in that community before I left a year later. 2 of them were adults. The generation was lost. The generation was lost because when Brother Ruth, it sounds funny to say that was his last name. When Brother Ruth passed on, no one picked up the mantle. No one continued his work. And 20 years later, when I met his widow, an entire generation had been born and grown up and was having children. And we're not walking with Elohim. When Noah had lived 500 years, Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and talk about the branches. Y'all get that? Don't want to talk about the branches. My children will tell you that's a dad joke. What we see here and what is borne out in the next few chapters is how a culture will break down. I believe that's one of the messages, because we have here the righteous line that will lead to Abraham, eventually to Mashiach, and to us. We have the unrighteous line of Ham. Shem was the righteous line, by the way. We have the unrighteous line of Ham. Ham will do something so awful that Noach will look at him and say that his son, not Ham, but his son is cursed because of what Ham did. Not because he's being punished for what his father did, but because he's going to learn what his father did and believe that it's good and live his life that way by that model. And all of his descendants will be cursed to the point that Elohim will say that their only purpose for existing becomes taking care of the land of milk and honey and getting it ready for our people to come in. And then we're going to talk about the line of Japheth. And Japheth's line takes after the pattern of their father, their patriarch. And although Scripture never specifically says it, it reads to me that they tried to take a middle ground. They weren't the awful, terrible, horrible people that Ham's descendants became, but they were not striving to be what the descendants of Shem were. They tried to walk a middle line between the kingdom and the world. And eventually we get to where they're no longer mentioned. Woe to us if we become the people who are no longer mentioned. So often I hear preachers say, woe to us if we become the people who are so awful that our deeds could be recorded in scripture as horrible things. I say it's just as terrible to be those individuals who are so lukewarm that nothing they do could ever be mentioned. It's also the first mention of triplets in scripture. Just thought I'd throw that in. Coming from a medical background, I find that interesting. Not saying it's the only time or the first time that it ever happened, but literally it says that when he was 500 years old, he begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We know scripture says he had one wife. Okay. I suppose it's possible the two of them were twins and the other one was a single birth and it all happened within a year, but probably not. Probably they were all three born to him in the same conception. Do we have a midrash on this? Questions? No?